Okay, we are on more pitfalls of adoption and how do they fare. The chosen child story, most often told to adopted children, only emphasizes in their minds that they were not chosen by their own biological families. Add to that the assumption by agencies and adopters that every child is better off being adopted, and one cannot understand how a child may carry feelings of rejection and inferiority into adulthood. Georgianne Bone herself, an adoptee and former employee at Patton State Hospital, a mental health facility in California, worked with 3 Caucasian patients. They were all male: a rapist, a child molester, and an arsonist. All 3 had been adopted from foster care. One might assume their behaviors originated at the pre-adoption stage, unless one considers that most adoptees who killed were adopted at birth, which is Lori Carangelo has another book. It's called Adopted Killers: 420 Adoptees Who Killed. It's available on Amazon, but she does have a short chapter in here about a little bit about it. You can check that out. It'll be posted soon. Anywho, let's move on. This is well understood if one considers that each individual has their own genetic and acquired personality and tolerances, and that the adoptees are punished for the sins of parents when adoption wipes out their true identities, origins, and reality, to be replaced by the legal fiction they were, quote unquote, born to. The adopters, aka the birth certificate, legally changes and gets sealed, which is annoying. Children nowadays are usually told from a young age they were adopted, but not the who, what, and why, leaving a child to fantasize whether their mother was a prostitute, a princess, or whether they were unwanted, or somehow to blame for their abandonment. Of internees at Coldwater Canyon Center for Personal Development Psychiatric Hospital, 65 to 85% are adoptees. And that's according to Dr. Lee Bloom, former unit director at the Coldwater Canyon Hospital in '86. At times, as many as half of the Coldwater's preteen and teenage hospitalized population are adoptees, and that's also according to Richard Sherman of the Coldwater Canyon Center. 40% of psychiatric internees are adoptees. Adopted children have a higher rate of emotional and psychological problems than the general population of youngsters. That is according to Dr. Phyllis Chesler in Mothers on Trial, quoting Dr. William Murdoch, child psychologist from Loma Linda University School of Medicine in California. 40% of adoptees end up in schools for disturbed children, of total adoptee population that the government estimated to be only about 2% of the general population. That's according to Dr. Stephen Nickman on the Geraldo Show in 1988. About 35% of young people receiving psychological help are adoptees. That's by Ruben Pinar, MSW. 20 to 35% of internees at several hundred private psychiatric hospitals in 13 regions are adoptees, and that is according to Betty Jean Lifton, a psychologist and adoptee, quoting from a report by an Illinois physician at a conference of the American Adoption Congress Conference, New York, in 1988. By the way, those conferences usually happen every year. I hope to go to one soon. I used to go to them when I was young with my parents, and they usually take place in Albany, which is pretty good. Anyway, Lifton later wrote in January of The Adopted Self, A Quest for Wholeness, Basic Books, 1994, adoption disease can lie dormant most of one's life. If it erupts in childhood, adolescence, or early adulthood, and if dismissed, it can subside into numbness, but it can stir malignancy in some adoptees all of their lives. 5 to 15% of the patient load in mental clinics in the average reported figure for adoptees under psychiatric care, although official government statistics estimate only 2% of the population are adoptees. 20 to 30% of adolescents and children in private psychiatric therapy are adoptees. That is according to Lincoln Kaplan in an open adoption, and is quoted in Bottom Line in 1990. Often, an adoptee's dysfunction results from post-adoption abuse of another kind, as following AM4 case reflects. Donna Lee Morgan was named Donna Lee Sayre at birth on July 10, 1953, in San Antonio, Texas. She resided with her adopters from 1959 until 1966, when, at age 13, she was abandoned by her adopters, John and Florence Morgan, to a state mental hospital where she was confined against her will by court order for 7 years until 1973, when at legal age she was magically permitted her freedom. The court ordered alleged schizophrenic reactions and sexual preoccupations. She was only 13. With autistic reveries. God, I hate those back days. Oh, man, sorry, it's hard to read. It's hard to hear some of this stuff. Today, it might have been determined that she had been sexually abused and was reacting as any sexually abused child would react. But sexual abuse was not often reported. Even in the 1970s, past sexual abuse of young female adoptees by their male adopters and other adoptive family members is frequently reported today by now adult adoptees. Donna was able to get her adoption file opened by court order and found that her biological mother had died. She also obtained her medical psychiatric records from the Florida Mental Hospital. But the Baptist Hospital in Texas initially refused to release her record of birth. It was only through AM4's intervention and much persistence that it eventually provided her with an apology from the hospital staff. Sorry. H.J. Sants and E.E. Welsh suggested that adopted children have, in addition to general cases of maladjustment, the burden of adoption stress. They found genealogists' bewilderment to be a large factor in their condition, that a child's ignorance of their past causes them more prone to dysfunction. 25% of the girls in residence at the school maintained for disturbed girls by the Jewish Board of Guardianship in New York were adopted. This is according to Professor David Fanchel at the New York School of Social Work. A decade after social work, an adoptee, Jean Patton, published her 1954 studies on adoptive families, the first studies linking adoptee behaviors with their adoptions. Sociologist and adopter H. David Kirk, in his 1964 book, Shared Fate, A Theory of Adoption and Mental Health, characterized adopters as being a role handicapped, and the adoptees as being prone to behavioral problems and emotional disturbance, partially because of the differences between adoptees and their adopters that belie as born-to myth. More than a decade later, David Krishner, Ph.D., coined the term adopted child syndrome. In his 1978 studies, described a set of 8 behaviors as underlying dissociative disorder in the adoptees he studied, which included Son of Sam and the adopted, this is quoted in Son of Sam and the Adopted Child Syndrome, Adelphi Society for Psychoanalysis and Psychotherapy newsletter, 1978. Oh, that was the article. Sorry. Yeah, Son of Sam was adopted. I am seriously thinking about breaking down some different adoptive serial killers. Because first of all, I'm a true crime junkie, but also knowing that adoption and like the mental what they're going through fascinates me. But I also want to pay homage to their victims because it is not fair to them as well. Okay, sorry, I went off on a rant. Krishner wrote, I believe that most adoptees have the same emotional vulnerabilities that are seen in dramatic form in adopted child syndrome, and that all adoptees are at risk. Yet he is careful to qualify that only a subset of a spectrum of adoptees have adopted child syndrome behaviors. Without defining the spectrum in which subset occurs, as a result of interviews with over 20,000 adoptees, the writer believes it means the entire spectrum of adoptees, the extremes of acquisitions at one end of the spectrum, and one of rebellion at the other end of the spectrum, which means, yes, all adoptees are at risk. Psychologist David D. Lincoln, Ph.D., who specialized in criminal behavior, believed only a few children with antisocial tendencies were born with such predispositions and blames most cases on poor parenting, which would be the adoptive parents. 2 decades after John Bowlby's Attachment and Loss, published in 1969, and As Advanced is the Primal Wound by Nancy Newton Verrier, which again we've already read on this channel, Kent G. Bailey, PhD, authored Human Paleopsychology: Application to the Aggression and Pathological Process. And that was in 1987. Bailey supports the concept of paleopsychology, a term he coined. Bailey sees adoption to be a dysfunction of kinship, and that the adoptee perceives many people in his world as strangers. This may even include his adopters, as Michael Reagan, adopted son of President Ronald Reagan, expressed it feeling as an outsider on his book on The Outside Looking In.